March 17, 1943. Room 401, West 118th Street, Manhattan, New York. The chalk dust settled on Abraham Wald's fingers as he completed another equation on the blackboard, numbers that would ultimately save thousands of American lives in ways no one in that cramped Columbia University apartment could yet comprehend. The problem before him contradicted everything military logic seemed to dictate. American bombers are being destroyed over Europe at an unsustainable rate. The solution appears obvious to everyone. Add armor where the planes show the most damage. But something deeper troubled the Hungarian mathematician as he studied the diagrams spread across his desk. What if the obvious answer is precisely the wrong answer? Through the March frost on the windows, Wald could see the Manhattan streets below, civilians going about their daily business, unaware that in this modest apartment building, the statistical research group was waging a different kind of war. A war fought with equations and logic rather than guns and bombs. The data before him told a simple story. Bomber after bomber returning from raids over Germany showed concentrated damage patterns. Wings peppered with holes, fuselage sections shredded by flak, tail assemblies torn by enemy fire. Yet somehow these crippled aircraft made it home. The military brass wanted armor precisely where these wounds appeared. They wanted protection for sections that, by all evidence, seemed most vulnerable to enemy attack. Wald set down his chalk and picked up the latest damage report from the 8th Air Force. 17 B-17 flying fortresses had departed from their English base yesterday morning. 13 returned. Of those 13, every single aircraft bore damage to wings, fuselage, or tail sections. Not one showed significant hits to engines or cockpit. The pattern held across hundreds of missions, thousands of returning bombers. The statistical consistency was remarkable. It was also, Wald realized with growing certainty, a trap. The missing planes held the answer. The 4 B-17s that never returned from yesterday's mission could not be examined. Their damage patterns would never be recorded. Their bullet holes would never be counted. They existed only as empty spaces at the debriefing, as names added to casualty lists, as telegrams that would soon arrive at family homes across America. But in those missing aircraft lay the truth that everyone else was overlooking. In the silence of the planes that never came home, Wald heard the answer shouting. 1,500 miles east, at Molesworth Airfield in Huntingdonshire, England, Captain Robert Morgan stood in the cold March dawn, watching ground crew patch yet another set of holes in his B-17. Memphis Belle. 24 missions completed. One to go before his crew could go home. The aircraft looked like it had been through a meat grinder. The wing sections bore dozens of holes, some large enough to fit a man's fist through. The tail gunner's position had taken a cannon round that had, by some miracle, missed Sergeant John Quinlan by inches. The ball turret showed evidence of machine gun fire that had somehow missed every critical component. Morgan ran his hand along the patched aluminum skin and thought about the crews who didn't make it back yesterday. Lieutenant Harrison's plane had gone down in flames somewhere over Belgium. Last anyone saw, the engines were burning, and the aircraft was in a death spiral. Lieutenant Patterson's fortress had simply exploded over the target, engines catching fire from flak, the subsequent fireball consuming the entire aircraft in seconds. 9 men from Harrison's crew, 10 from Patterson's. 19 more empty beds in the barracks. 19 more letters for commanding officers to write. 19 more families whose lives would never be the same. What separated Memphis Belle from those doomed aircraft? Morgan wondered about it constantly. Skill? His crew was good, but so were Harrison's and Patterson's. Luck? Perhaps. But as missions accumulated, as more and more crews failed to return, luck seemed like an insufficient explanation. There had to be some pattern, some factor that determined which aircraft survived and which did not. The Army Air Force was trying to find that pattern. That's why they documented every hit, every scar, every piece of damage on returning aircraft. Somewhere in those thousands of data points, the answer must lie. Morgan didn't know it yet, but 1,200 miles away in Manhattan, a mathematician had already found that answer. And the truth was more counterintuitive than anyone in the 8th Air Force had imagined. The Statistical Research Group had been formed in the summer of 1942, a collection of America's brightest mathematical minds assembled for one purpose: apply statistical analysis to military problems, find solutions through numbers and logic, save American lives through the power of mathematics. The group occupied a nondescript apartment building near Columbia University, and to casual observers, it looked like nothing more than a collection of professors working on academic problems. But behind those unremarkable doors, some of the most important work of the war was being conducted. Abraham Wald was the group's resident genius. Born in Kolozsvár, Transylvania, in 1902, Wald had been forced to flee Austria in 1938 when Nazi persecution of Jews made his position at the University of Vienna untenable. He arrived in America with his mathematics, his brilliant mind, and little else. By 1942, he was on the faculty at Columbia University and had been recruited to the Statistical Research Group, where his abstract mathematical thinking would be applied to very concrete problems of life and death. The smartest person in the room, colleagues called him. Frederick Mosteller, who would later found Harvard's statistics department, worked alongside him. So did Milton Friedman, future Nobel laureate in economics. Leonard Jimmy Savage, pioneer of decision theory. George Stigler, another future Nobel winner. Even in that collection of extraordinary intellects, Wald stood apart. His ability to see through complex problems to their essential mathematical structure was unmatched. His approach to analysis was rigorous, uncompromising, and often led to conclusions that surprised everyone, including himself. The bomber armor problem arrived at the SRG in early 1943, presented by Army Air Force officers who brought detailed damage reports from hundreds of missions over occupied Europe. The officers laid out the data with confidence. Here, they said, pointing to diagrams showing aircraft damage patterns. These are the vulnerable areas. Wings taking significant hits. Fuselage sections repeatedly struck. Tail assemblies frequently damaged. We need your group to calculate the optimal armor distribution for these vulnerable zones. How much weight can we add without compromising performance? What's the minimum armor thickness needed for protection? Where exactly should reinforcement be concentrated? The military's logic seemed airtight. Examine the damage on returning aircraft. Identify the most frequently hit areas. Add armor to protect those areas. Simple, direct, obvious. The SRG's job was merely to optimize the implementation. Calculate the precise specifications. Provide the mathematical framework for a solution everyone already knew. Wald listened to the presentation without speaking. He studied the damage diagrams, noting the clusters of hits on wings, the concentration of strikes on fuselage sections, the frequency of tail damage. He examined the data tables showing hit percentages by aircraft section. He reviewed photographs of damaged but surviving aircraft, their aluminum skin torn and shredded yet still bringing their crews home safely. Then he asked the question that changed everything. Where are the planes that didn't come back? The officers looked at him in confusion. Sir, those planes were shot down. We don't have them to examine. We can only analyze the aircraft that returned to base. Exactly, Wald replied. And that is the problem. The room fell silent. The statistical research group members exchanged glances, some beginning to see where Wald's logic was heading. The military officers looked puzzled, unsure what the mathematician was driving at. Wald walked to the blackboard and began to sketch. He drew a simple outline of a bomber, then marked the areas where damage concentrated on returning aircraft. Wings, fuselage, tail, heavy concentrations of hits, all in zones where aircraft regularly sustained damage yet still made it home. Now Wald said, consider what this data actually tells us. These aircraft, despite being hit repeatedly in these areas, survived to return to base. The pilots landed them. The crews walked away. The planes can be repaired and will fly again. What does this demonstrate about these particular areas? The officers began to understand. These areas, despite showing the most damage, were not actually the most critical areas. Aircraft could absorb hits to wings, fuselage, and tail and still survive. The damage looked dramatic but was not necessarily fatal. Wald turned back to the blackboard. He pointed to the areas showing little or no damage on returning aircraft. Engines, cockpit, central fuel systems. These areas, he explained, show minimal hits in our data, not because enemy fire avoided these zones. The Luftwaffe gunners and flak batteries didn't discriminate. They shot at the entire aircraft. The reason these areas show less damage in our surviving aircraft sample is that aircraft hit in these zones didn't survive to be counted. The insight was staggering in its simplicity once stated. The data they had been analyzing represented only the survivors. Every damage report came from an aircraft that had, by definition, sustained non-fatal damage. The fatal hits were not in the data, because aircraft suffering fatal hits never returned to be examined. The entire dataset was skewed by survivorship bias. Wald proceeded to develop the mathematical framework to prove his insight. He made several assumptions. First, that enemy fire was essentially random across the aircraft, that no particular section received deliberately concentrated fire. Second, that the probability of a plane surviving a hit did not depend significantly on previous hits. Third, that the hit distribution on aircraft that went down would, absent any particular vulnerability, match the distribution on aircraft that returned. Using these assumptions, Wald derived equations to estimate the vulnerability of different aircraft sections. The mathematics was complex, involving probability theory and statistical inference, but the conclusion was clear. The areas showing the least damage on returning aircraft were actually the most critical areas. A hit to an engine meant the plane likely went down. A hit to the cockpit meant the pilot might be killed instantly. A hit to certain fuel system components meant fire and catastrophic failure. The armor, Wald concluded, must go where the bullet holes are not. Specifically, engines must be protected. The cockpit must be reinforced. Critical fuel lines must be shielded. These were the vulnerable points. A single hit to these areas could mean the difference between a crew coming home or dying over enemy territory. The military officers were skeptical at first. The recommendation seemed backwards. Armor the parts that show the least damage. Ignore the parts taking the most hits. It contradicted conventional military thinking. But as Wald walked them through the mathematics, as he demonstrated the logical necessity of his conclusion, resistance crumbled. The man was simply correct. The data, properly interpreted, told a story very different from the obvious narrative. Wald's recommendations were forwarded up the chain of command, and by late spring of 1943 implementation began. New B-17 bombers rolling off assembly lines at Boeing's Seattle plant, at Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach, at Lockheed Vega in Burbank, incorporated additional engine protection. Existing aircraft received retrofits when they returned to depots for major maintenance. Armor plates were added around engines. Additional protection was installed for the cockpit. Critical fuel system components received shielding. The results were dramatic. Loss rates began to decline. More bombers were returning from missions. More crews were surviving. The armor added weight, approximately 400 pounds per aircraft, which meant slightly less bomb load or slightly reduced range. But the trade-off was worth it. A bomber that returned could fly again tomorrow. A bomber that went down was lost forever, along with its irreplaceable trained crew. At Molesworth, Captain Morgan completed Memphis Belle's 25th and final mission in May of 1943. His aircraft had been hit repeatedly in wings, fuselage, and tail. But the engines had kept running. The cockpit had protected its crew. The fuel systems had held. Morgan and his men became the first 8th Air Force crew to complete their tour and return home. They would tour America, selling war bonds, their story becoming legend. But they owed their survival not just to skill and courage, but to a mathematician in Manhattan who understood what the data was really saying. Sergeant James O'Brien, ball turret gunner on a B-17 named Flak Magnet, remembered the day his aircraft took a direct flak burst that should have been fatal. October 19th, 1943. The burst occurred less than 50 feet below the bomber, sending thousands of fragments tearing upward through the aircraft's belly. The ball turret where O'Brien sat took multiple hits. Plexiglass shattered, metal shredded, but the turret mechanism continued functioning. The electrical systems maintained power. O'Brien was wounded but alive. The engines, however, had been shielded by the recent armor upgrades. Fragments that would have penetrated the engine cowlings and destroyed the Wright Cyclone engines were stopped by the additional plating. The aircraft, on only 3 engines and severely damaged, managed to limp back across the English Channel. O'Brien survived. Flak Magnet was eventually repaired and flew again. Post-mission analysis showed that without the engine armor, the aircraft would have lost all 4 engines and gone down over France. 10 men would have died instead of 1 being wounded. Lieutenant William Lawley, pilot of a B-17 named Cabin in the Sky, experienced the life-saving effect of cockpit armor on February 20th, 1944 during a mission to Leipzig, Germany. His aircraft was attacked by Focke-Wulf 190 fighters making frontal attacks. 20mm cannon shells hit the cockpit area, 1 round penetrating the windscreen. The round struck Lawley in the face, partially blinding him and causing severe wounds. But the additional cockpit armor installed per Wald's recommendations deflected other rounds that would have killed him outright. Despite his wounds, Despite 8 other members of his crew being injured, Lawley managed to fly the crippled bomber back to England. He would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions. He would later credit the cockpit armor with saving his life and the lives of his crew. The mathematics of survival played out across thousands of missions. The 8th Air Force flew its first mission in August of 1942. By the end of the war in May of 1945, the 8th would fly over 250,000 sorties. 26,000 aircrew would be killed, 23,000 would be captured. But tens and of thousands who might have died were saved by armor placed not where obvious damage appeared, but where Wald's mathematics indicated critical vulnerability existed. The principle Wald identified became known as survivorship bias. It is the logical error of concentrating on things that survived some process, while overlooking those that did not, typically because of their invisibility. The error arises because the complete dataset is never available. The failures, by their nature, cannot be examined as readily as the successes. This leads to false conclusions if the survivor pool is analyzed, as if it were representative of the entire original population. Survivorship bias appears far beyond wartime aircraft analysis. It affects how we interpret success in business, where we study successful companies while ignoring the far more numerous failures. It affects medical research, where follow-up studies only include patients who survived long enough to be followed up. It affects our understanding of financial investments, where mutual fund performance statistics systematically exclude funds that went bankrupt. It affects our perception of historical events, where we hear stories of the winners while the losers' perspectives are lost. But in 1943, survivorship bias was a new concept, and Wald's work in identifying and correcting for it was groundbreaking. His paper, titled A Method of Estimating Plane Vulnerability Based on Damage of Survivors, was completed in July of 1943 and classified immediately. It would not be published publicly until 1980, when the Center for Naval Analyses released Wald's wartime memoranda as historical documents. But the work's impact was immediate and profound. Wald went on to make other significant contributions to the war effort. He developed sequential analysis methods that reduced the amount of testing needed for ordnance quality control, saving time and resources while maintaining reliability standards. He worked on problems of aircraft pursuit curves, helping optimize fighter tactics against bombers. He tackled statistical problems in naval gunnery, improving the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire. Each problem required sophisticated mathematical thinking applied to life or death situations. Each solution saved American lives. The statistical research group as a whole made enormous contributions. The group developed methods for optimizing convoy formations to minimize submarine losses. They worked on improving the accuracy of bomb sights. They calculated optimal torpedo settings. They analyzed the effectiveness of different types of ammunition. The group's work touched nearly every aspect of the war, applying mathematical rigor to questions that had previously been answered by intuition or tradition. Frederick Mosteller worked on problems of sequential analysis alongside Wald. Leonard Savage developed early work in decision theory. Milton Friedman contributed to sampling inspection methods for ammunition. George Steigler worked on military economic problems. Alan Wallace, who directed the group, coordinated the work and managed the relationship between the mathematicians and the military. The collaboration between academic mathematics and military necessity produced results neither could have achieved separately. The 30 women who served as computers for the statistical research group deserve recognition as well. Before electronic computers, computation meant human beings performing calculations by hand, using mechanical calculators, slide rules, and extensive handwritten tables. These women, mostly mathematics graduates from Hunter College or Vassar, performed the laborious calculations that turned the mathematicians' equations into usable results. They checked and double-checked figures, compiled data, and generated the tables that military planners needed. Their work was essential to everything the group accomplished. By the end of 1943, bomber loss rates had stabilized and begun to decline. Early in the year, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers at an unsustainable rate. The mission to Schweinfurt on August 17, 1943, saw 60 B-17s shot down out of 376 dispatched, a loss rate of 16%. The follow-up mission to Schweinfurt on October 14th saw 65 bombers lost out of 291, over 22%. At such loss rates, the entire strategic bombing campaign was in jeopardy. Crews were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Aircraft production could barely keep up with losses. Multiple factors contributed to the eventual reduction in loss rates. The introduction of long-range escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang in early 1944, provided protection for bombers deep into German territory. Improved tactics, including better formation flying and more effective defensive maneuvers, reduced vulnerability to fighter attack. Enhanced electronic warfare capabilities interfered with German radar and communications. Growing experience among crews increased survival rates as airmen learned techniques for evading flak and fighting off interceptors. But armor placement, guided by Wald's analysis, played a crucial role. Engine protection reduced the catastrophic losses from single-hit kills. Cockpit reinforcement kept pilots alive and at the controls even after being hit. Fuel system shielding prevented fires that had previously doomed damaged aircraft. The cumulative effect of these protections, each adding only marginal improvement, combined to create substantial increases in aircraft survivability. The human cost of the strategic bombing campaign remained staggeringly high despite all improvements. Of the roughly 350,000 men who served in 8th Air Force bomber crews during the war, 26,000 were killed in action, represented a death rate of approximately 7.5%. But the death rate had been much higher earlier in the war, reaching peaks of 10 to 12% in late 1943. Wald's work, along with other improvements, brought that rate down. Thousands of aircrew who would have died instead survived and came home. The statistical analysis extended beyond just armor placement. Wald's group examined optimal crew rest schedules to reduce fatigue-related accidents. They analyzed the effectiveness of different defensive gun positions, leading to modifications in B-17 design. They studied abort rates and their causes, helping identify mechanical problems before they became catastrophic. They examined weather impact on mission success, helping planners optimize timing and routes. The comprehensive statistical approach transformed Air Force operations from intuition-based to data-driven. Colonel Malcolm Grow, Chief Surgeon of the 8th Air Force, applied similar survivorship bias thinking to personal armor for aircrew. Grow noticed that 70% of injuries to bomber crew came from low-velocity shrapnel from flak shells, not from high-velocity projectiles from fighter guns. This meant that relatively light armor could provide protection against the most common threat. Working with the Wilkinson Sword Company in Britain and later with American manufacturers, Grow developed the Moan Flyers vest, a flak jacket containing small manganese steel plates sewn into fabric. The flak vest weighed approximately 17 pounds, but it reduced fatalities from thoracic wounds by 78% and abdominal wounds by over 80%. Aircrew initially resisted wearing the vests due to the weight and bulk, particularly in cramped aircraft positions like the ball turret. But as word spread about crews surviving hits that would previously have been fatal, resistance vanished. By the end of the war, over 300,000 flak vests had been produced. Like Wald's armor placement analysis, the personal armor program required looking past the obvious to identify the actual threat and the actual solution. The German Luftwaffe, interestingly, conducted similar damage analysis on their own aircraft, but failed to account for survivorship bias. German aircraft designers added armor to the most frequently damaged areas based on returning aircraft analysis, the exact mistake Wald's work was designed to avoid. This contributed to German aircraft being over-armored in non-critical areas, while remaining vulnerable in critical zones. The Me-262 jet fighter, introduced late in the war, was particularly prone to engine failures from combat damage, despite having substantial armor protection for its fuselage. German designers never fully understood why their armor programs seemed less effective than expected. The Japanese faced even worse problems with aircraft survivability. Japanese design philosophy emphasized offensive capability over defensive protection, resulting in aircraft that were fast and maneuverable but extremely vulnerable to damage. Japanese bombers were notoriously prone to catching fire when hit, their fuel tanks lacking self-sealing technology. Japanese fighters like the Zero could be brought down by remarkably little damage. This vulnerability contributed to the eventual collapse of Japanese air power, as losses mounted faster than they could be replaced. American aircraft, in contrast, became increasingly survivable as the war progressed. The B-29 Superfortress, introduced in 1944 for operations against Japan, incorporated all lessons learned from Wald's analysis and earlier combat experience. The aircraft featured extensive armor around engines, cockpit, and critical systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires. Redundant control systems meant the aircraft could remain controllable even with significant battle damage. The result was an aircraft that could absorb punishment that would have destroyed earlier bombers. The B-17 Flying Fortress itself evolved dramatically from early models to late war variants. The B-17C, which entered service in 1941, had 4.50 caliber machine guns and minimal armor. It weighed about 49,650 pounds maximum takeoff weight. The B-17G, the final and most numerous variant, had 13.50 caliber machine guns, substantially more armor, particularly around engines and cockpit, and weighed 65,000 pounds at maximum takeoff. The increased weight came from better defensive armament and improved protection, all based on combat experience and statistical analysis. Each B-17G cost approximately $238,000 in 1943 money. The aircraft required 4 Wright Cyclone R 18-20-97 radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower. It carried a crew of 10, had a service ceiling of 35,000 feet, and could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs for short-range missions or 4,000 pounds for long-range strikes. With a wingspan of 103 feet and 9 inches and length of 74 feet and 9 inches, it was a substantial aircraft requiring significant infrastructure and support. The economics of bomber protection were carefully calculated. Each pound of armor meant less bomb load, or reduced range, or slower speed. But each bomber lost cost not just $238,000 in aircraft, but 10 highly trained crew members, each of whom had received months of training at considerable expense. A pilot went through approximately 200 hours of flight training before being assigned to a combat crew. Bombardiers, navigators, and other specialists each required extensive schooling. The total cost of training a bomber crew exceeded the cost of the aircraft itself. This made aircraft protection not just humane but economically rational. Spending a few $1,000s on additional armor to increase the probability of crew survival by even a few percentage points was an excellent investment. Wald's work provided the mathematical framework to optimize this investment, ensuring that armor dollars were spent where they would provide maximum benefit rather than minimum benefit. The transformation in military decision-making represented by Wald's work cannot be overstated. Prior to the Statistical Research Group and similar organizations, military planning relied heavily on tradition, intuition, and the judgment of experienced officers. These remained important, but were supplemented by rigorous quantitative analysis. Questions that had been debated based on opinion could now be answered with mathematics. Controversies that had persisted for years could be resolved with data. This represented the birth of operational research as a formal discipline. The British had begun developing similar capabilities earlier in the war, with physicist Patrick Blackett leading operational research efforts for the British military. The combination of scientific thinking and military problems proved extraordinarily productive. Blackett's group made major contributions to anti-submarine warfare, radar effectiveness, and bomber effectiveness. The American Statistical Research Group complemented these efforts with even more sophisticated mathematical techniques. After the war ended in 1945, the Statistical Research Group dissolved. Its members returned to academic life or moved into industry. Wald returned to teaching at Columbia, where he continued his research in mathematical statistics. He developed sequential analysis into a complete theoretical framework, publishing the book Sequential Analysis in 1947. The book became a classic in statistics and demonstrated the power of the techniques developed under wartime pressure. Tragically, Wald's post-war career was cut short. In December of 1950, he and his wife were traveling in India at the invitation of the Indian government. Wald was to deliver lectures on statistics to Indian mathematicians and government officials. On December 13th, their Air India DC-3 crashed in the Nilgiri Mountains in southern India. Wald, his wife, and all others aboard were killed. The loss was devastating to the statistics community. Wald was only 48 years old and at the height of his intellectual powers. Wald's legacy extended far beyond his wartime work. His contributions to sequential analysis revolutionized quality control in manufacturing. His work in decision theory laid foundations for future developments. His approach to statistics, emphasizing rigorous mathematical foundations combined with practical applications, influenced generations of statisticians. Students who trained under Wald went on to become leaders in statistics departments around the world. But the bomber armor work remains Wald's most famous contribution, both because of its immediate life-saving impact and because it illustrates such a fundamental principle. The story has been repeated thousands of times in statistics courses, business seminars, and decision-making training programs. It serves as a perfect example of how proper analysis can overturn common sense, how mathematical thinking can reveal truth hidden by intuition. The principle applies broadly to modern problems. In medicine, clinical trials must account for survivorship bias by tracking all enrolled patients, not just those who complete the trial. In business, analysis of successful companies must be balanced by understanding failed companies. In finance, investment performance must be evaluated considering funds that closed, not just surviving funds. In education, student success must be measured including those who dropped out, not just graduates. Everywhere we look at successful outcomes, we must ask about unsuccessful outcomes that are invisible in our data. The bomber armor problem also teaches humility about data analysis. Having data is not enough. Having lots of data does not automatically yield correct conclusions. The military had excellent data collection, detailed damage reports from hundreds of missions. But without proper analytical framework, that data led to wrong conclusions. It took Wald's insight to recognize that the dataset was systematically biased by the collection method itself. Modern big data analytics faces similar challenges. The availability of massive datasets does not guarantee correct analysis. In fact, larger datasets can make survivorship bias and similar problems worse if they reinforce systematic collection biases. The solution is not just more data, but better analytical thinking, the kind of thinking Wald exemplified, asking what is missing from the data, questioning whether the sample is representative, understanding the process that generated the data and how that process might bias conclusions. The 8th Air Force completed its final combat mission on April 25, 1945. By that time, the transformation from the dark days of 1943 was complete. Loss rates had declined to sustainable levels. Crews had reasonable expectation of surviving their tour. The strategic bombing campaign had achieved its objectives, destroying German industrial capacity and crippling the Luftwaffe. The cost had been terrible, 26,000 American aircrew killed, but it would have been worse without the work of people like Abraham Wald. Today, a diagram showing an aircraft with damage marks clustered in certain areas has become iconic in statistics and decision-making courses worldwide. The diagram, often simplified for teaching purposes, illustrates the fundamental principle. The areas showing the most damage are the places the aircraft can afford to be hit. The areas showing no damage are the places that, if hit, prevent the aircraft from being in the dataset at all. The lesson applies far beyond World War II bombers. When we study successful people, we should ask about unsuccessful people with similar traits. When we analyze surviving businesses, we should consider failed businesses. When we examine historical events, we should remember the perspectives of those who did not survive to record their stories. The missing data often tells the most important story. Abraham Wald, working in a cramped Manhattan apartment with chalk and blackboards and mechanical calculators, saw what others missed. He understood that the answer lay not in the data before him, but in the data that could not be collected. He saved thousands of lives by recognizing the significance of what was absent. His work stands as testament to the power of mathematical thinking, to the importance of questioning obvious answers, to the value of looking for what is missing rather than only analyzing what is present. The bombers kept flying, the crews kept fighting. But more of them came home because a mathematician understood the truth hidden in survivorship bias. In the end, that was Abraham Wald's greatest contribution. Not an equation, not a theorem, but a way of seeing. A recognition that sometimes the most important information is the information we do not have, and the wisdom to factor that absence into our calculations. The legacy continues. Military planners still use Wald's techniques when evaluating equipment survivability. Statistical researchers still cite his papers. Teachers still use the bomber armor story to illustrate fundamental principles. The statistical research group's work during World War II demonstrated that mathematics is not merely an academic pursuit, but a practical tool for solving real problems. That partnership between theoretical thinking and practical application, between pure mathematics and applied problem-solving, remains a model for how to tackle difficult challenges. Every science builds on foundations laid by those who came before. Wald's work on survivorship bias built on earlier statistical theory, which built on probability theory, which built on fundamental mathematics. But Wald's insight transformed understanding. He did not just apply existing techniques to a new problem. He recognized a fundamental analytical error that had been invisible to others. That recognition changed how we think about data analysis itself. The principle Wald identified, The systematic bias introduced by examining only survivors applies to virtually every domain of human activity. In warfare, survivors tell one story while casualties tell another. In business, successful companies reveal certain patterns while failed companies reveal different patterns. In medicine, surviving patients demonstrate one set of characteristics while deceased patients demonstrated another. In education, graduates show particular features while dropouts show different features. Understanding the complete picture requires accounting for both the visible and the invisible. Modern data science grapples with similar issues in the age of big data. Algorithms trained on existing datasets inherit the biases in those datasets. If the data collection process systematically excludes certain outcomes or populations, the resulting analysis will be systematically wrong. Machine learning models can perpetuate and amplify survivorship bias if not carefully designed to account for missing data. The fundamental insight Wald provided in 1943 remains critically relevant in the 21st century. The bomber crews of the 8th Air Force never knew the name Abraham Wald. They did not know that a mathematician in Manhattan was analyzing their survival patterns. They did not understand that armor placement on their aircraft was guided by sophisticated statistical analysis rather than common sense. They simply knew that more of them were coming home as the war progressed. They knew that hits to engines, while still dangerous, were less likely to be fatal than early in the war. They knew that cockpit protection gave pilots a better chance of surviving fighter attacks. Thousands of aircrew members owed their lives to decisions made by people they never met, based on analysis they never knew existed. This is often how science saves lives, invisibly, through small improvements that accumulate into substantial effects, through careful analysis that identifies optimal solutions, through the patient work of people working far from the front lines, but contributing just as surely to victory. Abraham Wald died in 1950, but his work lives on. Every time a statistician corrects for survivorship bias, Wald's insight influences the analysis. Every time a military planner considers what missing data might reveal, Wald's principles guide the thinking. Every time a decision-maker looks beyond the obvious to consider hidden information, Wald's legacy continues. The story of bomber armor placement is fundamentally a story about the power of proper thinking, about the importance of questioning assumptions, about the value of mathematical rigor, about the necessity of looking beyond surface appearances to underlying truth. These lessons transcend their World War II context. They apply to modern challenges just as they applied to wartime problems. When we face difficult decisions, when data seems contradictory, when obvious answers feel wrong, we should remember Abraham Wald's insight. Look for the missing information. Consider what survivorship bias might be hiding. Question whether the available data represents the complete picture or only a biased sample. Ask not just what the data shows, but what data is absent and why. The specific implementation of Wald's recommendations occurred across multiple phases and required coordination between design teams, manufacturing facilities, and field modification units. Boeing's engineering department in Seattle received the specifications in late spring of 1943 and immediately set to work revising production drawings. The challenge was adding armor without fundamentally redesigning the aircraft structure. The B-17 had been designed without this level of engine protection, so adding it meant working within existing weight and balance constraints. Chief Engineer Wellwood Beale directed a team of 30 engineers who spent 6 weeks developing the modifications. The engine armor consisted of steel plates ranging from 1/8 inch to 3/8 inch thick, positioned to protect critical engine components from most angles of attack. The plates added approximately 80 pounds per engine, total of 320 pounds for all 4 engines. Additional cockpit armor, including reinforced seatbacks for pilot and co-pilot and additional glazing protection, added another 60 pounds. Fuel system protection added approximately 20 pounds. Total weight increase per aircraft, 400 pounds. 400 pounds might seem modest on an aircraft with maximum takeoff weight of 65,000 pounds, but it represented approximately 10% of the bomb load. Mission planners had to recalculate range and payload for every target. An aircraft that could previously carry 5,000 pounds of bombs to Berlin now carried 4,600 pounds. This required adjusting the number of aircraft assigned to each mission to maintain desired total tonnage on target. The trade-off was clear, but not simple. Less explosive power delivered per mission, but more aircraft surviving to fly subsequent missions. Production implementation began with B-17G aircraft rolling off the line in August of 1943. Aircraft serial number 42-31000 received the first complete armor package, according to Wald's specifications. Captain James Howard, test pilot for Boeing's military division, flew the aircraft through extensive trials to verify that handling characteristics remained acceptable. The additional weight and altered center of gravity affected performance slightly. Maximum speed decreased by 3 miles per hour. Service ceiling dropped by 200 feet. Rate of climb decreased marginally, but handling remained predictable and control responses stayed within acceptable limits. Field modification of existing aircraft proved more challenging than production changes. Thousands of B-17s were already in service in England, North Africa, and Italy. Modifying these aircraft required depot-level maintenance at facilities that were already overwhelmed with battle damage repairs and routine maintenance. The Army Air Force established priority systems. Aircraft with less than 50 missions received modifications first, as they had longest remaining service life. Aircraft with extensive combat damage awaiting repair received modifications during their rebuild process. Aircraft with more than 100 missions generally did not receive modifications, as they were near the end of their service life anyway. Technical Sergeant Michael Rossi, aircraft maintenance specialist at Alconbury Depot in England, remembered the modification program well. His crew modified 17 aircraft in October of 1943 alone. Each modification required approximately 80 man-hours of work. Remove existing engine cowlings. Install new armor plates. Remount cowlings. Test fit everything. Check clearances. Verify no interference with control cables or hydraulic lines. Paint anti-corrosion coatings. Reinstall inspection panels. Ground run engines to verify normal operation. The work was tedious and precise. Bolt holes had to line up perfectly. Armor plates had to fit flush against engine mounts. Wiring harnesses had to be rerouted to avoid sharp metal edges. Fuel lines needed protection without being constricted. Every modification was inspected by quality control specialists before the aircraft was released back to operational status. Mistakes meant aircraft could be damaged or destroyed. Crews could be killed. There was no tolerance for error. By January of 1944, approximately 60% of 8th Air Force bombers had received the armor modifications. By April, nearly 90%. The Pacific Theater, where B-17s faced different threats primarily from fighter attack rather than flak, received similar modifications though, with some variations in armor placement reflecting the different combat environment. Bombers operating from bases in Italy received modifications on a similar schedule as those in England. The statistical impact became measurable within months. During August through October of 1943, before widespread armor implementation, the 8th Air Force lost bombers at an average rate of 4.3% per mission. During January through March of 1944, after armor implementation, the loss rate dropped to 3.1% per mission. Multiple factors contributed to this decline, but analysis by the 8th Air Force Operational Research Section determined that approximately 40% of the reduction could be attributed to improved armor protection. Translated into actual aircraft and crew, the numbers were substantial. If the 8th Air Force flew an average of 400 bombers per mission and conducted 20 missions per month, the reduction from 4.3% to 3.1% loss rate meant approximately 96 fewer aircraft shot down per month. At 10 crew per aircraft, that meant 960 fewer casualties per month. Over the period from January through December of 1944, when the 8th Air Force flew its most intensive operations, the improved armor contributed to saving approximately 11,500 aircrew lives that would otherwise have been lost. These numbers cannot be proven with absolute certainty, of course. Counterfactual analysis always involves assumptions. What would have happened without the armor changes? We cannot know for sure. But statistical modeling using combat data, loss records, and damage reports provided reasonable estimates. The confidence intervals were wide, perhaps between 8,000 and 15,000 lives saved, but even the lower bound represented a significant number of young men who came home to their families instead of dying over Europe. Individual aircraft told the story more personally than statistics. B-17 serial number 4297,064, nicknamed Lady Luck, took a direct hit from an 88mm flak shell on March 6, 1944, during a mission to Berlin. The shell struck the number 3 engine, the inboard engine on the right wing. Shrapnel from the shell hit the armor plates, protecting the engine's reduction gear case and oil reservoir. Without the armor, the shrapnel would have penetrated, destroying the reduction gear and draining the oil system. The engine would have seized within minutes. Running at combat power with a seized engine would have meant catastrophic failure, likely engine fire, possible loss of the wing. With the armor, the shrapnel was stopped. The engine took damage but continued running. The pilot feathered the damaged engine and flew home on 3 engines. The crew survived. Lady Luck was repaired and flew 63 more missions before the war ended. B-17 serial number 4337718, nicknamed Hell's Angels, experienced 5 separate combat missions where engine armor stopped potentially fatal damage. On a mission to Merseburg on November 2, 1944, a Focke-Wulf 190D fighter made a head-on attack, firing 20mm cannon shells directly into the number 1 engine. 2 shells penetrated the engine cowling but were stopped by the armor plates. The engine's cylinders remained intact. The engine continued running. Without the armor, the shells would have shattered the cylinder heads, destroyed the engine, likely caused an uncontrollable fire. Hell's Angels continued to target, dropped its bombs, and returned safely. The crew chief counted 7 cannon shell impacts on the engine, 4 stopped by armor, 3 missing the engine entirely. Pure luck combined with engineering. Lieutenant Colonel Ben Lay, who flew combat missions early in the war before transferring to staff positions, wrote extensively about the transformation in bomber survivability. His articles in military journals and later in popular magazines explained the statistical analysis to a broad audience. He described Wald's work without naming him, as the statistical research remained classified during the war. But he made clear that mathematical analysis had identified the vulnerable areas and that armor placement based on that analysis was saving lives. Lay's writing reached bomber crews who wanted to understand why they were surviving when earlier crews had not. The psychological impact was significant. Crews had greater confidence in their aircraft. They felt that the Army Air Force was using their best thinking to protect them. Morale improved, which itself contributed to combat effectiveness. Confident crews flew better, fought harder, supported each other more effectively. The virtuous cycle of better equipment, better training, and better morale created a force that became increasingly formidable as the war progressed. The Luftwaffe noticed the improved American bomber survivability and tried to counter it with heavier armament on fighter aircraft. The Fu-190A8 variant introduced in late 1943 carried 4 20mm cannons plus 2 13mm machine guns, much heavier armament than earlier models. The Mi-410 heavy fighter carried 4 20mm and 2 30mm cannons, specifically for bomber attack. German pilots were trained to focus fire on critical aircraft areas, particularly engines and cockpit. But the increased firepower came at a cost. Heavier armament meant more weight, which meant reduced performance. The FW-190A8 was noticeably slower than earlier variants. The Mi-410 was a sluggish aircraft, vulnerable to American escort fighters. German aircraft design was caught in the same trade-offs that Americans faced with bomber armor. Every advantage in one area meant disadvantage elsewhere. The laws of physics and engineering applied equally to both sides. German engineers also struggled with material shortages. High-grade steel for armor was in increasingly short supply as the war continued. Aluminum for aircraft structures was scarce. Fuel quality declined as Germany lost access to Romanian oil fields, and as Allied bombing destroyed German synthetic fuel plants. German aircraft late in the war often flew with inferior fuel, causing engine problems and reduced performance. Even excellent design could not overcome material and logistical problems. The Japanese faced even more severe challenges. Japanese industry was smaller and less sophisticated than German industry. Quality control was often poor. Materials were scarce. Worker training was inadequate. Japanese aircraft suffered from structural problems, engine reliability issues, and quality inconsistencies that made even well-designed aircraft unreliable. The B-29 raids on Japanese home islands beginning in November of 1944 devastated Japanese industry further, making it impossible to maintain production quality. American industrial capacity, in contrast, grew throughout the war. Boeing's production of B-17s peaked at 16 aircraft per day in April of 1944. Douglas and Lockheed added significant additional production. Total B-17 production reached 12,731 aircraft by the end of the war. More than 8,600 were the B-17G variant with the improved armor protection. Each represented thousands of hours of engineering, hundreds of workers, tons of aluminum, steel, rubber, and other materials, all coordinated through supply chains spanning the continent. The economic dimension of aircraft protection extended beyond the aircraft itself. Consider the complete cost of putting a B-17 over Germany with a trained crew. Aircraft cost, $238,000. Pilot training, approximately $10,000 including aircraft time and instructor costs. Co-pilot training, $8,000. Navigator training, $6,000. Bombardier training, $7,000. Flight engineer training, $4,000. Radio operator training, $3,000. 5 gunner positions at $2,000 training cost each, $10,000. Total crew training cost, approximately $48,000. Add the aircraft cost, $286,000 to put one bomber with one crew into combat. Now factor in operational costs. Fuel for a long-range mission, approximately 2,800 gallons at 70 cents per gallon in bulk military purchase, call it $2,000. Bombs, 4,000 pounds at approximately $1 per pound, $4,000. Ammunition, 5,000 rounds of .50 caliber at approximately $1 per round, $5,000. Maintenance man-hours, approximately 20 hours of maintenance for every flight hour, 400 hours at $2 per hour loaded labor cost, $800. Total cost per combat mission, approximately $11,800. A bomber lost on its first mission meant $297,800 of investment destroyed. A bomber lost on its 10th mission meant $286,000 plus $118,000 in operational costs, total $404,000 lost. A bomber that survived 35 missions, the standard required tour length for most of the war, represented $286,000 plus $413,000 in operational costs, nearly $700,000 invested. But that bomber could then be assigned a new crew and fly another tour. The economic calculation for armor protection became straightforward when viewed this way. If 400 pounds of armor costing $500 in materials and labor could increase aircraft survival probability by even 5%, the investment paid for itself immediately. A 5% increase in survival rate meant 5 more bombers returning from every 100 deployed. 5 bombers at $238,000 each, $1,190,000 of aircraft saved, plus 50 crew at $10,000 average training cost, $500,000 of human capital preserved, plus the intangible value of experienced crews, which cannot be easily quantified but was enormous. Wald's analysis provided the crucial insight not about whether to armor aircraft but where to armor them. The military already understood that armor was valuable. What they did not understand was that their intuitive approach to armor placement was systematically wrong. Wald's contribution was identifying the cognitive error and providing the mathematical framework to correct it. This was worth far more than the direct protection the armor provided, because it taught military planners how to think properly about survivability data. The lessons learned from bomber armor analysis spread to other aircraft types and other nations. Fighter aircraft received similar analysis. Attack aircraft, which flew low and faced intense ground fire, were analyzed to identify vulnerable areas. Transport aircraft, helicopters, everything that flew in combat eventually received similar scrutiny. The British applied Wald's principles to RAF Bomber Command aircraft. The Soviets, through intelligence sharing after Germany's defeat, learned of the analysis and applied similar thinking to their aircraft designs. Post-war, the analysis influenced commercial aviation safety. Where should aircraft be reinforced to improve crash survivability? What areas need protection from bird strikes? How should fuel systems be designed to minimize fire risk? The same analytical principles applied. Examine where failures occurred, but more importantly, identify what was missing from the failure data. Understand that catastrophic failures, by definition, were not present in the sample of repairable damage. The National Transportation Safety Board, established in 1967 to investigate transportation accidents, adopted analytical approaches descended directly from Wald's wartime work. When examining aircraft accidents, NTSB investigators now routinely ask not just what failed, but what did not fail. What systems on the accident aircraft remained functional? What can this tell us about the failure sequence? What is missing from the physical evidence, and what does that absence suggest? These questions echo Wald's fundamental insight about survivorship bias. Modern computational methods allow more sophisticated analysis than Wald could perform with mechanical calculators and hand calculations. Finite element analysis can simulate aircraft structural response to damage. Computational fluid dynamics can model how damage affects aircraft performance. Monte Carlo simulations can explore thousands of scenarios to identify vulnerability patterns. But the fundamental principle remains Wald's. The data you can collect is systematically biased by the fact that it comes from survivors, and you must correct for this bias to reach valid conclusions. Military applications of survivorship bias analysis extended to vehicle armor beyond aircraft. The US Army's analysis of tank armor during World War II suffered from similar problems as early aircraft analysis. Tanks that returned from combat showed damage patterns that initially suggested where additional armor should be placed. But proper analysis, applying Wald's principles, revealed that different areas were actually most critical. Engine compartments, ammunition storage, and crew positions needed priority protection, even though they showed less visible damage on surviving tanks. Modern body armor design for infantry also applies these principles. Where do soldiers need protection? The obvious answer is where they most frequently get hit. But this misses critical areas. A soldier hit in the torso is much less likely to return to base for analysis than a soldier hit in the limbs. The data is biased towards survivable hits. Proper armor design must account for this. Vest designs prioritize torso and head protection, even though limb hits are more numerous in the dataset of treated casualties. The mathematical framework Wald developed went beyond just identifying bias. He created methods for estimating the true vulnerability distribution from biased data. Given data only from survivors, plus reasonable assumptions about the combat environment, Wald's equations could calculate the probability that hits to each aircraft area would prove fatal. These probability estimates then guided armor allocation decisions. The mathematics was rigorous and has stood the test of time. Modern statisticians examining Wald's wartime papers find the analysis sound and the methods still applicable. Wald's broader contributions to statistics extended his bomber armor work into general principles. His development of sequential analysis revolutionized quality control testing across industries. Instead of testing fixed sample sizes, sequential analysis tests items one at a time, continuously evaluating whether enough evidence has accumulated to make a decision. This dramatically reduces required sample sizes when products are either much better or much worse than specifications require. Manufacturing companies adopted sequential methods rapidly after the war, realizing enormous cost savings. Wald's work in decision theory laid foundations for modern approaches to decision-making under uncertainty. How do you make optimal decisions when you don't have complete information? How do you balance the cost of gathering more information against the value of making a decision sooner? These questions arise in every domain, from business to medicine to public policy. Wald's mathematical framework provided systematic approaches that remain fundamental to decision theory today. The statistical research group's work collectively demonstrated that mathematical analysis could address problems that seemed beyond analytical reach. How to organize convoy formations to minimize submarine losses. The SRG worked it out. How to set torpedo depth settings for maximum effectiveness against different ship types. The SRG calculated it. How to allocate anti-aircraft ammunition between different projectile types. The SRG optimized it. Problem after problem yielded to mathematical thinking where intuition had been insufficient. This transformation in military operations research continued after the war. The RAND Corporation, established in 1946, brought together mathematicians, economists, engineers, and strategists to analyze defense problems. The Institute for Defense Analyses, founded in 1956, performed similar functions. The Center for Naval Analyses, which published Wald's wartime papers in 1980, continues this work. Operations research as a discipline grew from these wartime origins into a major field applied in countless industries and applications. The human stories behind the statistics remained paramount. Each percentage point improvement in survival rates represented dozens or hundreds of real people. Young men, mostly between ages 19 and 26, who enlisted or were drafted, who trained for months, who flew into danger repeatedly, who depended on their aircraft to bring them home. The armor protecting them was specified by mathematicians who never flew combat missions, manufactured by workers who never saw the results of their labor, installed by mechanics who rarely met the crews they were protecting. The extended network of people contributing to combat effectiveness stretched from university mathematics departments to factory assembly lines to forward air bases. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of Memphis Belle, met Abraham Wald after the war during a chance encounter at a Columbia University function in 1947. Morgan had been invited to speak about his combat experiences. Wald attended the lecture. During the reception afterward, they were introduced. Morgan thanked Wald for his work on aircraft protection, having learned about it from a post-war article. Wald demurred, saying he had merely done the mathematics, that the real heroes were the men who flew the missions. But Morgan insisted. The armor you specified saved my crew and me multiple times. Hits that would have destroyed our engines were stopped by the plates. Protection that wasn't there at the start of the war made the difference between us completing our tour and going down over France or Germany. Your mathematics translated directly into lives saved. Wald listened, clearly moved, and later told colleagues that meeting bomber crews and hearing their stories made his wartime work feel real, in a way it had not while he had been doing calculations in Manhattan. That connection between abstract mathematics and concrete human outcomes characterized the statistical research group's significance. These were not academic exercises. Every equation represented lives at stake. Every calculation mattered, because real people depended on getting the right answer. The pressure was intense. The responsibility was heavy. But the mathematicians rose to the challenge and made contributions that would have seemed impossible before the war demonstrated what could be achieved. The broader lesson from Wald's work extends beyond military applications. In any field where we make decisions based on data from survivors, successes, or winners, we must ask what we are missing. Business analysts studying successful companies must also study failed companies. Medical researchers studying patients who completed treatment must also track patients who dropped out. Educators studying graduates must also understand dropouts. Investors analyzing successful investments must also learn from failures. The complete picture requires seeing both what is present and what is absent. This is difficult. Failed companies often destroy their records. Lost aircraft cannot be examined. Deceased patients cannot report symptoms. Dropouts do not remain available for follow-up studies. The absence of data is not random, it is systematic and biased. Overcoming this bias requires careful thinking, explicit assumptions, and mathematical modeling to estimate what the missing data would show if it could be collected. Wald provided the template for how to do this rigorously. The World War II experience demonstrated that nations with superior analytical capabilities would have significant military advantages. American and British operations research provided important edges in multiple theaters and across many dimensions of warfare. German and Japanese forces, despite tactical excellence and often superior equipment early in the war, lacked equivalent analytical sophistication. This analytical gap contributed to Allied victory perhaps as much as industrial capacity or manpower advantages. Post-war, this lesson was not forgotten. The Cold War saw massive investments in analytical capabilities by both American and Soviet blocs. Nuclear strategy, arms control verification, force structure planning all relied heavily on sophisticated analysis. Game theory, developed largely at RAND and similar institutions, provided frameworks for understanding strategic interactions. Linear programming and optimization theory addressed resource allocation problems. Computer simulation enabled exploration of scenarios too complex for analytical solution. Abraham Wald would not live to see most of these developments. His death in 1950 cut short a career that would likely have produced many more major contributions. But his wartime work lived on, influencing every field where people make decisions based on incomplete or biased data. The bomber armor analysis became the canonical example of survivorship bias, taught in statistics courses worldwide, cited in thousands of academic papers, referenced in countless business presentations and policy analyses. The mathematical principle is straightforward once explained. The application requires insight and careful thinking. The impact can be enormous. That summarizes Wald's contribution. He saw what others missed because he asked the right question. Where are the missing aircraft? And what can their absence tell us? The answer saved thousands of lives during World War II and continues to save lives today whenever people apply his lessons to modern problems. The B-17 bombers that survived World War II missions told one story. The B-17s that did not survive told another. Together, These stories revealed the truth about aircraft vulnerability, but only one who understood the significance of both stories, who recognized that absence of data is itself informative, could discern that truth. Abraham Wald was that one, and thousands of American aircrew lived because he saw what others missed. In the final analysis, Wald's work represented the triumph of careful, analytical thinking over intuition and common sense. Intuition said armor the damaged areas. Common sense agreed. Experience seemed to confirm it, but rigorous mathematical analysis revealed the error. The damaged areas were the survivable areas. The critical areas showed no damage precisely because aircraft hit there did not survive to be counted. This insight required genius, but it also required humility to question obvious conclusions and discipline to work through complex analysis when simple answers appeared sufficient. That combination of genius, humility, and discipline characterized the statistical research group and characterized Abraham Wald personally. In an era where many academics focused purely on theoretical problems, Wald embraced applied work. In a field where intuition often dominated, he insisted on mathematical rigor. In situations where quick answers were demanded, he took time to get the right answer. These qualities made him uniquely suited for the bomber armor problem and for the many other challenges he tackled during his too short career. The thousands of aircrew who owed their lives to Wald's work flew home after the war, married, raised families, built careers, contributed to their communities. Their children and grandchildren now number in the hundreds of thousands. All exist because Abraham Wald, working with chalk and blackboard in a Manhattan apartment, understood what missing data meant. That is his true legacy. Not equations or papers or academic honors, though he received those, but lives saved, families created, futures made possible, mathematics in service of humanity, analysis in service of life. That is what Abraham Wald gave the world through his work on bomber armor and his broader contributions to statistics and decision-making. The story reminds us that sometimes the most important questions are not about what we see, but about what we do not see. Not about what is present, but about what is absent. Not about the survivors, but about those who did not survive. Asking these questions, thinking about missing information, understanding bias in data collection, these are skills we can all develop. We may not have Wald's mathematical genius, but we can adopt his approach to analysis. Question obvious conclusions. Look for what is missing. Consider whether the data is representative or systematically biased. Think carefully about what the absence of information tells us. These principles apply whether we are analyzing bomber damage, evaluating business strategies, assessing medical treatments, planning educational programs, or making personal decisions. The habits of mind that Wald demonstrated, the willingness to question, and the discipline to analyze carefully, serve us well in any domain. That may be his most enduring contribution. Not just the specific insights about aircraft armor, but the example of how to think rigorously about problems where data is incomplete and bias is subtle but important. The detailed implementation of armor protection revealed engineering challenges that required innovative solutions. Engine armor plates had to withstand high temperatures from engine operation, while also stopping shrapnel and cannon shells. The Wright Cyclone engines generated tremendous heat, and metal placed too close to hot engine components would warp, crack, or fail. Engineers experimented with different steel alloys to find materials that combined hardness for protection with heat resistance for durability. The solution involved manganese steel plates, the same material used in flak vests for aircrew. Manganese steel offered excellent ballistic protection relative to weight. When hardened properly, a 3/8-inch plate could stop most shrapnel and resist all but direct hits from 20mm cannon shells. The plates were mounted on standoffs, small metal spacers that kept the armor separated from the hot engine surfaces by approximately 2 inches. This gap allowed air circulation for cooling while still providing protection. Installation required careful attention to engine access for maintenance. Mechanics needed to reach spark plugs, check oil levels, inspect cylinders, adjust valves, replace fuel lines, and perform dozens of other maintenance tasks. If armor plates blocked access, maintenance would become impossible and aircraft would be grounded. Engineers designed armor panels that could be removed quickly using quarter-turn fasteners, allowing mechanics to swing open armored cowl sections for full engine access during scheduled maintenance. The weight distribution of added armor also required attention. Aircraft have precisely calculated centers of gravity. Too much weight forward makes the nose heavy and affects handling. Too much weight aft causes tail heaviness and potential control problems. The B-17 already had relatively forward center of gravity due to its heavy nose section with bombardier position, navigator station, and nose gun turret. Adding 400 pounds, mostly in engine nacelles which were located on the wings forward of the aircraft's center of gravity, could potentially worsen this. Boeing engineers recalculated the entire aircraft's weight and balance with armor added. They determined that the center of gravity shift was approximately 0.7 inches forward, within acceptable limits. They revised the aircraft's weight and balance documentation to reflect the changes. They recalculated loading procedures for bombs, fuel, and ammunition to ensure the aircraft remained properly balanced throughout the mission, as fuel was consumed and bombs were dropped. Flight testing with the armored configuration required hundreds of hours. Test pilots flew through every conceivable maneuver. Normal flight envelope testing, verifying that the aircraft handled properly at all speeds and altitudes. Stall testing, ensuring that the aircraft's stall characteristics had not changed dangerously. Engine out testing, verifying that the aircraft could maintain control with one or more engines failed. Emergency procedures testing, practicing forced landings, bailout procedures, and ditching. Combat maneuver testing, simulating defensive actions against fighter attack. The test results showed that the armor's effect on performance was minimal but measurable. Maximum speed decreased from 287 miles per hour to 284 miles per hour at 25,000 feet altitude. Service ceiling decreased from 35,000 feet to 34,800 feet. Rate of climb decreased from 900 feet per minute to 870 feet per minute at sea level. Range with maximum fuel decreased from approximately 2,000 miles to 1,950 miles. These were all acceptable trade-offs for substantially improved protection. Combat testing followed formal testing. 5 B-17s with full armor packages were assigned to the 91st Bombardment Group at Bassingbourn, England, in September of 1943. These aircraft flew 10 combat missions each under intensive observation. Every mission was followed by detailed debriefings focusing specifically on aircraft performance. Pilots reported no handling difficulties. Engineers inspected the armor after every mission, looking for loosening bolts, cracking welds, warped plates, or any other problems. One armored aircraft, tail number 4231075, nicknamed Iron Mike, took a direct hit from an 88mm flak shell on its third mission. The shell struck the number 2 engine, the inboard engine on the left wing. The explosion sent fragments through the engine nacelle. Without armor, the fragments would have destroyed the engine's reduction gear case, crankcase, and oil system. With the armor, the fragments were stopped or deflected. The engine was damaged but continued running long enough for the pilot to shut it down normally and feather the propeller. The aircraft returned to base on 3 engines. Inspection showed that the armor plates were badly dented and one had cracked, but they had absorbed the blast energy and protected critical components. This combat validation convinced any remaining skeptics. The armor worked as Wald's analysis predicted. Aircraft hit in protected areas survived hits that would previously have been fatal. The formal combat testing ended and full fleet implementation began in earnest. By the end of 1943, armor modification was standard procedure for all B-17 production and all depot-level maintenance. The ripple effects of Wald's work extended beyond just the B-17 program. The B-24 Liberator, the other main American heavy bomber, received similar analysis and similar armor improvements. The B-24 had different vulnerabilities due to its different configuration: high-mounted wing, twin vertical stabilizers, deeper bomb bay. Wald's team analyzed B-24 combat data separately and provided specific recommendations for that aircraft type. The same principle applied: armor the critical areas, even if those areas showed little damage in the survivor data. Medium bombers like the B-25 Mitchell and B-26 Marauder received attention next. These aircraft flew lower and faced more intense ground fire. Their vulnerability patterns differed from heavy bombers. But the analytical approach remained the same. Examine survivor damage, but more importantly, understand what the absence of damage in certain areas indicated. Apply armor where the analysis indicated greatest vulnerability, not where obvious damage suggested vulnerability. Fighter aircraft presented different challenges. Fighters had to be light and maneuverable. Adding armor meant accepting reduced performance. But fighters also faced intense firepower from bombers they attacked and from enemy fighters they engaged. Pilot protection became paramount. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a large single-engine fighter, carried substantial pilot armor. The cockpit was protected by armor plate behind the pilot's seat and additional plates on either side. The engine, a massive Pratt & Whitney radial, had armor around critical components. The P-51 Mustang, a lighter and more agile fighter, carried less armor but still protected the pilot and engine. Engineers had to be selective. Every pound of armor reduced combat effectiveness, so protection focused on the most critical areas. Wald's principle applied. Protect areas where damage would be immediately fatal. Accept vulnerability in areas where damage might be survivable long enough to escape combat. Attack aircraft like the P-38 Lightning faced the heaviest ground fire. These aircraft flew low-altitude missions against heavily defended targets. Flak was intense. The P-38's twin-boom configuration made it vulnerable in ways that conventional single-fuselage aircraft were not. A hit to one boom could destroy an engine and also compromise flight control surfaces mounted on that boom. Engineers added protection for the cockpit area between the booms and for the engine nacelles. The weight penalty was significant but necessary given the mission. The systematic application of survivorship bias analysis to all combat aircraft types represented a revolutionary change in military aviation. Before Wald's work, armor placement was largely based on engineering intuition and pilot feedback. After Wald's work, it was based on rigorous statistical analysis. The shift from intuition to analysis paralleled similar shifts occurring throughout military operations. War was becoming more scientific, more mathematical, more data-driven. This trend would accelerate in the post-war era and continues to the present day. The human dimension of these technical changes deserves emphasis. Behind every statistical table, every armor plate, every engineering drawing were real people. Engineers working long hours to design protection. Factory workers manufacturing components. Mechanics installing armor in cold English hangars. Crews flying the aircraft into combat. Each person contributed to the overall system that delivered bombers to targets and brought them home. Staff Sergeant Anthony Rizzo, crew chief for a B-17 named Lucky Lady, took personal pride in maintaining his aircraft's armor. After every mission, Rizzo inspected every armor plate. He checked for loosening bolts, tightening them if needed. He looked for cracks in the armor plates, reporting any to engineering for replacement. He verified that armor had not shifted position during combat maneuvering, which could create gaps in protection. His attention to detail meant that Lucky Lady's armor was always in perfect condition, ready to protect its crew on the next mission. Rizzo's dedication was typical of crew chiefs throughout the 8th Air Force. These men took personal responsibility for their aircraft. Many painted their name under the pilot's window, identifying themselves as the aircraft's crew chief. They worked through rain, snow, and cold. They repaired battle damage, often improvising repairs with whatever materials were available. They kept the aircraft flying despite maintenance challenges that would have grounded civilian aircraft immediately. The relationship between aircrew and ground crew was symbiotic. Flight crews depended absolutely on ground crew to maintain their aircraft properly. Ground crew took satisfaction in seeing their aircraft return safely from missions. When aircraft were lost, ground crew mourned. They had maintained those aircraft, cared for them, knew every quirk and characteristic. The loss of an aircraft meant the loss of crew members they knew personally. The emotional toll on ground crew is often overlooked in histories that focus on aircrew losses, but ground personnel suffered alongside their flying comrades. The broader statistical analysis of bomber operations produced insights beyond just armor placement. Wald and his colleagues examined formation effectiveness, finding that tight formations provided better mutual defensive fire protection than loose formations. They analyzed optimal altitude for different targets, balancing accuracy of bombing against vulnerability to flak. They studied the effectiveness of different bomb types against different targets, helping mission planners select optimal ordnance for each raid. They examined crew fatigue patterns, helping establish appropriate crew rest policies. This comprehensive analytical approach transformed the 8th Air Force from an organization operating largely on tradition and intuition to one making data-driven decisions. The transformation took time. Many officers resisted analytical approaches, preferring to rely on their combat experience and judgment. But as the analysis proved its value through improved outcomes, resistance diminished. By late 1944, statistical analysis was integral to planning every aspect of bomber operations. The legacy of this transformation extended far beyond World War II. Post-war military organizations institutionalized operational research. The Air Force established dedicated operational research units. The Navy did likewise. The Army followed. These units employed civilian analysts, military officers with analytical training, and support staff. They tackled problems ranging from weapons procurement to logistics planning to force structure design. The analytical capabilities that emerged from the Statistical Research Group's wartime work became permanent features of modern military organizations. Commercial aviation borrowed many techniques from military operational research. Airline schedulers used linear programming to optimize flight schedules. Maintenance planners used statistical analysis to schedule aircraft overhauls. Safety analysts examined accident data to identify risk factors, always mindful of survivorship bias and other analytical pitfalls. The Federal Aviation Administration employed analysts to examine regulatory effectiveness and identify areas needing improved safety focus. The pharmaceutical industry adopted sequential analysis techniques for drug testing. Instead of fixed-size clinical trials, companies began using sequential designs that could stop trials early if a drug proved clearly effective or clearly ineffective. This saved time and money while maintaining statistical rigor. The Food and Drug Administration incorporated sequential methods into its approval processes. Patients benefited from faster approval of effective drugs and faster rejection of ineffective or dangerous drugs. Manufacturing quality control was revolutionized by sequential analysis. Factory production lines implemented sequential sampling inspection, dramatically reducing the number of parts that needed testing while maintaining or improving quality assurance. The savings in inspection costs were substantial, and product quality often improved because sequential methods detected problems faster than fixed sample size methods. In every field where Wald's methods spread, the common thread was more efficient use of information. Sequential analysis extracts more value from each data point. Survivorship bias correction prevents systematic errors from biased samples. Proper statistical thinking leads to better decisions with less data. These principles have universal application wherever decisions depend on data. The technology available for analysis has advanced enormously since Wald worked with mechanical calculators and handwritten tables. Modern computers can perform in seconds calculations that took the statistical research group days or weeks. Simulation methods can explore scenarios impossible to analyze analytically. Machine learning can find patterns in data too complex for traditional statistics. Yet the fundamental principles Wald articulated remain valid. Computers amplify our analytical capabilities but do not replace the need for careful thinking about what data means and what it does not mean. The temptation to let computers substitute for thinking is perhaps greater now than in Wald's era. Large datasets and powerful algorithms can produce impressive-looking results that are nevertheless wrong if the underlying data is biased or the analytical approach is flawed. Wald's example reminds us that analytical sophistication must accompany computational power. We need both the ability to process data and the wisdom to interpret it correctly. The survivorship bias principle appears repeatedly in modern controversies. Financial markets systematically overstate returns because failed investments disappear from indexes. Medical studies systematically understate side effects because patients who develop serious complications drop out. Educational statistics systematically overstate program effectiveness because struggling students withdraw. Business advice systematically oversimplifies success because failed strategies leave no visible trace. In each case, the missing data would change the conclusion if it could be included. Recognizing survivorship bias is the first step. Correcting for it requires methods descended from Wald's work. Sometimes missing data can be reconstructed through careful research. Sometimes probability models can estimate what the missing data would have shown. Sometimes alternative data sources provide information about failures alongside successes. The specific technique varies by situation, but the underlying requirement is always the same. Acknowledge that the available data is incomplete and systematically biased, then employ appropriate methods to correct for the bias. Abraham Wald, mathematician, statistician, refugee, professor, analyst, genius. He took the problem of bomber protection, saw it with fresh eyes, applied mathematical sophistication, and changed the answer. In doing so, he saved thousands of lives and taught lessons that continue to resonate across decades and disciplines. His work stands as testament to the power of human intelligence, the importance of asking the right questions, and the profound impact that careful thinking can have on matters of life and death. The final measure of Wald's contribution lies not in equations or papers, but in lives saved and lessons taught. Thousands of aircrew who might have died instead came home because armor protected them, where Wald's analysis indicated protection was needed. Countless others in subsequent decades benefited from methods and principles that trace back to his wartime work. The compound effects of good ideas spreading through society are impossible to quantify precisely, but they are nevertheless real and substantial. When we think carefully about data, when we question obvious conclusions, when we look for what is missing alongside what is present, we honor Wald's legacy. When we apply statistical rigor to important decisions, when we resist the temptation to substitute computational power for analytical thought, when we remain humble about the limits of our knowledge, we follow his example. These habits of mind serve us well in any domain, whether analyzing bombers or businesses, evaluating treatments or technologies, assessing strategies or systems. The story of bomber armor and survivorship bias deserves its place as one of history's great analytical triumphs. Not because the mathematics was particularly advanced, though it was sophisticated. Not because the problem was uniquely difficult, though it was subtle, but because it illustrates so perfectly how proper thinking can overturn common sense and save lives. That lesson transcends its World War II context and speaks to every generation about the power and importance of getting analysis right. We would do well to remember Abraham Wald's example and strive to emulate his approach in our own analytical endeavors, whatever they may be. The world continues to present complex problems where data is incomplete, where bias is subtle, where obvious answers may be wrong. Meeting these challenges requires the same combination of mathematical rigor, intellectual humility, and careful thinking that Wald exemplified. If we can cultivate these qualities, if we can ask the right questions and resist the lure of easy answers, we honor his memory and extend his legacy into the future.